You ever sit there at like 2 in the morning, phone screen glowing in your face, staring at that credit card statement like it's some kind of horror movie you can't pause? That sick feeling crawling up your throat when you see the balance, the minimum payment blinking at you like it's offering mercy but you know it's a trap, and you're sitting there in the dark breathing heavy, telling yourself you got this under control even though your chest feels tight and your jaw's clenched and somewhere deep down you know you're lying? That moment right there, that's the exact second you realize you're not using the card anymore, it's using you. It's got you. And the worst part isn't even the numbers climbing, it's that you can't tell anyone, can't admit it out loud, can't even look yourself in the eye about it because if you do then it becomes real and if it's real then you gotta face the fact that you're trapped. That little piece of plastic in your wallet isn't convenience, it's a leash. And every time you swipe it, every time you convince yourself the minimum payment buys you another month of freedom, the leash gets shorter. You feel it tightening but you pretend you don't. You feel something watching you from the other side of that statement, something patient, something that knows you better than you know yourself. It knows you'll come back. It knows you'll pay just enough to stay caught. The thing nobody tells you about credit card debt is that it doesn't just live in your bank account, it lives in your body. You wake up and it's already there in your chest before you even open your eyes. You go through your day and it's humming under every decision you make, whispering in the back of your mind when you're trying to enjoy anything, reminding you that nothing's actually yours anymore, that you're always borrowing, always behind, always paying for yesterday with tomorrow's ghost money. And the crazy part? You keep swiping. You keep telling yourself it's fine, that you'll handle it next month, that this time you'll pay more than the minimum, that this time you'll get ahead of it. But you never do. Because the card doesn't want you to get ahead. It wants you right here, in this exact psychological space where you're terrified enough to keep paying but not brave enough to stop using it. It's got you in this weird limbo between panic and denial, and that's exactly where it wants you. If you're reading this right now and feeling that tightness in your chest, that shame you can't name, that sense that you're slowly losing something you can't get back, then you need to drop a comment below and just say, I see the chains. Not for me. For you. Because acknowledging the trap is the first step to even thinking about escaping it. And yeah, you're gonna want to stick around for what comes next, because what I'm about to show you is how deep this prison actually goes, how the card isn't just stealing your money, it's stealing your entire sense of self, piece by piece, swipe by swipe, and most people don't even notice until it's way too late. Let me tell you about someone who found out the hard way. If that tightened your chest, if you felt that tug of shame and denial in your throat, do one small thing for yourself right now. Hit subscribe. Come back here. This is where we pull the curtain off the quiet traps no one wants to name. Subscribe not for the channel, for your future self who's tired of being led on a leash. And if this landed on you, that little squeeze when you read it, drop a like. It's not for vanity, it's a quiet signal that you're done pretending the leash is freedom. Every like tells you and me, you're awake and you want out. His name doesn't matter because he's everybody. Let's call him M. Mid-20s, working 2 gigs, one of them barely part-time, the other just enough to keep the lights on and the rent mostly current. Lives in a studio in the valley, the kind of place where the walls are thin and the AC only works when it feels like it and you can hear your neighbor's entire life through the ceiling. M's not broke, but he's always just a little bit short, you know? Always got that gap between payday and bills, always got that moment where he's gotta decide what gets paid now and what gets pushed to next week. That's when the card came in. At first it felt like a lifeline, like a cheat code for adulting. Needed groceries? Card. Car broke down? Card. Wanted to take this girl out without looking like a scrub? Card. And every time he swiped it, there was this little rush, this tiny hit of relief, like he'd just solved a problem, like he'd outsmarted the system somehow. The limit was $3,000 and he told himself he'd never go above 1,000. That was his rule, his boundary, his line in the sand. But lines in sand don't mean much when the tide keeps coming in. 6 months in, he was at 2,200. Not terrible, he thought. Still got room. Still got control. He'd pay it down eventually once he picked up more hours, once that freelance gig came through, once. The once never came, but the charges kept coming and the balance kept creeping, and suddenly the minimum payment wasn't $60 anymore, it was $140, and that $140 felt like a fist around his throat every single month. He'd open the app and feel his stomach drop before he even saw the numbers. He'd look at that balance and feel this weird shame, this embarrassment that didn't make sense because nobody else could see it, nobody else knew, but it was there anyway, sitting on his chest like a weight he couldn't name. He started avoiding the app altogether. He'd set up autopay for the minimum and just let it ride, let it pull from his account every month and pretend it wasn't happening. Out of sight, out of mind. Except it wasn't out of mind. It was always there, humming in the background of every decision, every moment, every breath. He'd be at work and suddenly think about the balance and feel his chest tighten. He'd be trying to fall asleep and the numbers would flash in his head and he'd lie there staring at the ceiling feeling like he was drowning in slow motion. He'd see something he wanted, something small, something stupid, a pair of shoes or a video game or just a decent meal, and before he even thought about it his hand would reach for the card because that's what the card was for, right? That's what it was there for. To smooth out the gaps. To make life possible. Except life wasn't feeling possible anymore, it was feeling like a treadmill he couldn't step off, like every month he was running faster just to stay in the same place, and the card that was supposed to help him was the thing keeping him trapped. The worst part wasn't even the debt itself. The worst part was how it changed him from the inside. He started lying, little lies, casual lies, lies he didn't even think about. Someone would ask if he wanted to grab food and he'd say he already ate when really he just didn't want to spend money he didn't have, didn't want to pull out the card again, didn't want to feel that tiny spike of shame when it went through. He'd tell himself he was being responsible, that he was cutting back, that he was getting control, but really he was just hiding. He was shrinking. He was turning into someone smaller, someone quieter, someone who moved through the world with their head down and their shoulders tight because the card was always there, always watching, always waiting for him to need it again. And he always did. He always needed it. Because that's how they build the trap. They don't lock you in all at once, they let you walk involuntarily, they let you think you're in control, they let you believe the minimum payment is a choice when really it's a chain that gets tighter every single month until you can't remember what it felt like to breathe without it. Started noticing things. Little things. The way his jaw clenched when he checked his bank account. The way his heart rate spiked when a notification came through. The way he'd feel this low-grade anxiety all the time, this constant hum of dread that never quite went away, like he was always waiting for something bad to happen, always bracing for impact, always one swipe away from disaster. He wasn't living anymore. He was surviving. And the thing keeping him in survival mode wasn't his job, wasn't his rent, wasn't his life, it was a piece of plastic in his wallet that he couldn't stop using and couldn't pay off and couldn't escape. He tried once. Told himself he'd cut it up, told himself he'd go cold turkey, told himself he'd just deal with the balance and stop adding to it. He made it 11 days. 11 days before something came up, something always comes up, and he reached for the card like it was reflex, like it was instinct, like it was the only option he had. And when it went through, when that charge posted, he didn't feel relief. He felt defeat. He felt like he'd just proven something to himself, something ugly, something true. That he wasn't strong enough. That he couldn't do it. That the card owned him. And the balance kept climbing. Not fast, not dramatically, just steadily, quietly, like a tide you don't notice until you're already underwater. He'd pay the minimum and watch the balance barely move, watch the interest eat up half the payment, watch his future dissolve into numbers on a screen that never got smaller no matter what he did. It felt personal. It felt targeted. It felt like the card was mocking him, like it knew he'd never escape, like it was designed specifically to keep him right here, in this exact emotional space, forever. And maybe it was. Maybe that was the whole point. Because the card didn't need him to pay it off. The card needed him to keep paying. Keep swiping. Keep bleeding. Keep feeding it his time, his energy, his dignity, his future, one minimum payment at a time, forever and ever, until there was nothing left of him but the balance and the shame and the quiet, creeping knowledge that he'd never be free. Then one night M had this moment, this clarity that hit him like cold water, and it wasn't dramatic, wasn't some big revelation, it was just him sitting on his couch scrolling through his transaction history trying to figure out where the hell all his money went and suddenly seeing it. The pattern. The trap. He'd been paying the minimum for 14 months straight. 14 months of $140 going out like clockwork, autopay pulling it from his account before he even thought about it. He did the math in his head real quick, rough numbers, nothing exact. 14 times 140. That's almost $2,000. $2,000 he'd paid and he pulled up the balance and it had barely moved. It went from $2,200 to $2,800. He'd paid $2,000 and somehow owed more than when he started. That's when it clicked. That's when he realized the card wasn't waiting for him to pay it off. The card didn't want to be paid off. The card wanted exactly this. Wanted him making minimum payments forever, wanted him adding little charges here and there to keep the balance floating, wanted him trapped in this loop where he was always paying but never progressing, always moving but never arriving, always fighting but never winning. It wasn't a financial tool. It was a psychological leash. And the sick part, the part that made his stomach turn, was that he'd been complicit in his own imprisonment. He'd signed up for this. He'd agreed to the terms. He'd swiped the card knowing there'd be interest, knowing there'd be payments, knowing there'd be consequences. But he didn't know it would feel like this. Didn't know it would hollow him out from the inside. Didn't know it would become this thing that lived in his chest and whispered to him at night and made him feel like less of a person every single day. The card had become his identity. Not who he was but what he owed. Every decision he made was filtered through the balance. Every opportunity that came up got measured against the debt. Every moment of potential joy got crushed under the weight of knowing he was behind, always owing, always less than whole. He started seeing it everywhere once he knew what to look for. The way his coworkers talked about their cards like they were normal, like everyone had a balance, like everyone was juggling payments and limits and interest rates and it was just part of being an adult. The way commercials sold cards like freedom when really they were selling dependence. The way the minimum payment was always just low enough to feel manageable but high enough to keep you stuck. The way the limit increases came right when you were starting to get close to the top, like the card could sense you were about to max out and needed to give you more rope to hang yourself with. It was designed. All of it. Every piece of it was designed to keep you exactly where M was right now. Paying enough to stay trapped but not enough to get free. And the genius of it, the truly diabolical part, was that it made you feel like it was your fault. Like if you were just smarter, just more disciplined, just better with money, you'd be fine. But it wasn't about discipline. It wasn't about being smart. It was about the system being built to win and you being built to lose. M started feeling something he'd never felt before. Not anger exactly, more like horror. Like he'd woken up and realized he'd been sleepwalking toward a cliff and he was already halfway over the edge and his feet were still moving. He thought about all the hours he'd worked to make those minimum payments. All the shifts he'd picked up, all the side gigs he'd hustled, all the time he'd traded for money that went straight into a hole that never filled up. He thought about what he could have done with $2,000 if he'd never had the card in the first place. Could have saved it. Could have invested it. Could have used it for something real, something tangible, something that actually built toward a future instead of just paying for the past over and over again. But he didn't have that option anymore. The card had already taken it. Had already taken 14 months of his life and converted it into nothing. Into less than nothing. Into more debt. And the worst part, the part that made him want to scream, was that he couldn't stop. Even knowing all this, even seeing the trap clearly, even understanding exactly how it worked and why it worked and who it was designed to benefit, he still couldn't stop using it. Because his life hadn't changed. His income hadn't changed. His expenses hadn't changed. The gap was still there, that space between what he made and what he needed, and the card was still the only thing filling it. He was addicted. Not to spending, not to stuff, but to the feeling of not drowning. The card was the thing keeping his head above water even though it was also the thing pulling him under. It was the poison and the antidote. The disease and the symptom. The prison and the only place he knew how to exist. He'd become dependent on the thing destroying him and he couldn't imagine life without it because life without it meant facing all the gaps, all the shortfalls, all the moments where he didn't have enough and couldn't fake it and had to just sit in the reality of his situation without a buffer. And that was more terrifying than the debt. So he kept swiping. Kept paying the minimum. Kept telling himself he'd figure it out eventually. But eventually never came because eventually was always one more month away, always one more payment away, always just out of reach. The card had taught him to live in a permanent state of almost. Almost stable. Almost caught up. Almost in control. Almost free. But almost is just another word for trapped. Almost is where they want you. Almost is where you stay forever, paying and paying and paying, feeding the machine that feeds on your future, your dignity, your sense of self, until there's nothing left but the balance and the belief that this is just how life is now. This is just what being an adult means. This is just the cost of existing. And M started to believe it. Started to accept it. Started to think maybe this was just his reality now, that some people get ahead and some people tread water and he was always going to be the second kind, the kind who works hard and stays broke, the kind who does everything right and still loses, the kind who pays and pays and pays and never owns anything, not even his own peace of mind. The card had won. And it won so completely that he didn't even fight anymore. He just existed. Numb. Tired. Hollowed out. A person-shaped thing going through the motions while something invisible drained him from the inside. And nobody knew. Nobody could tell. Because debt doesn't leave marks you can see. It leaves marks you feel. In your chest. In your sleep. In the way you move through the world like you're already apologizing for taking up space. M was still alive but he wasn't living. He was just paying. If you've ever felt what M's feeling right now, if you've ever stared at a balance that won't shrink no matter what you do, if you've ever realized you're not using the card anymore, it's using you, drop a comment below and just type, "I see it." Don't explain. Don't justify. Just acknowledge that you see the trap. Because seeing it is the only way you start figuring out how deep it really goes. And trust me, you're gonna want to stay until the end of this because what comes next is the part they don't want you to know. The part about what the card is actually taking from you. And it's not just money. It's way worse than money. Keep watching. The thing about credit card debt that nobody talks about, the thing that makes it different from every other kind of trap you can fall into, is that it doesn't just take your money, it takes your time. And I don't mean time in the abstract sense, I mean literal hours of your life, days of your life, years of your life that you trade away to service a balance that never disappears. M started doing the math one night when he couldn't sleep, started calculating how many hours he'd worked just to make minimum payments, how many shifts he'd picked up, how many weekends he'd sacrificed, how many moments he'd missed because he was busy chasing money that was already spent before he even earned it. He worked it out to something like 400 hours over those 14 months. 400 hours of his life converted directly into interest payments and fees and charges that built nothing, created nothing, meant nothing except keeping him locked in place. That's 10 full weeks of work. 2.5 months of his life. Gone. Evaporated. Traded for the privilege of staying trapped. And that was just so far. If he kept going at this rate, if nothing changed, he'd spend years of his life doing nothing but feeding the card. Years he'd never get back. Years that could have been used for literally anything else. Learning something. Building something. Becoming someone. But instead those years would just dissolve into payments that barely moved the needle, into a debt that regenerated faster than he could kill it, into a future that kept getting pushed further and further away until it stopped feeling like a future at all and started feeling like a fantasy. But it wasn't just time the card was taking. It was identity. M started noticing how he introduced himself in his own head, how he thought about himself when nobody was watching. He wasn't a person with debt anymore. He was debt with a person attached. The balance had become the most important thing about him, the central fact of his existence, the lens through which everything else got filtered. He'd meet someone new and within minutes he'd be calculating in his head whether he could afford to hang out with them, whether their lifestyle was compatible with his budget, whether being around them would expose how broke he really was. He'd hear about opportunities, trips, experiences, chances to do something different, and his first thought was never, "Do I want this?" It was, "Can the card handle this?" The card had become his primary decision maker. His internal compass. His God. And he'd started shaping himself around it, cutting off pieces of who he used to be to fit inside the space the debt allowed him to occupy. He stopped making plans. Stopped dreaming. Stopped imagining a version of his life that looked different from this one because imagining it hurt too much when he knew he couldn't afford it. The card had taught him to think small. To want less. To become less. And the sick thing was he didn't even notice it happening until it was already done. His relationships changed too. Not in obvious ways, not in ways people could point to, but in subtle shifts that accumulated over time until he barely recognized himself in the way he interacted with others. He became distant. Guarded. Always a little bit unavailable because he was always a little bit somewhere else, always thinking about the balance, always worried about the next payment, always running calculations in the back of his mind about what he could afford and what he couldn't and how to hide the fact that he was drowning. His friends started inviting him out less because he always had an excuse, always had a reason he couldn't make it, always bailed at the last minute because the anxiety of spending money he didn't have was worse than the loneliness of staying home. He told himself he was being responsible, that he was prioritizing his finances, that he was making smart choices. But really he was just disappearing. Shrinking into a smaller and smaller version of himself until he fit inside the tiny space the debt allowed him to exist in. And the worst part was nobody noticed. Or maybe they noticed and didn't care. Or maybe they noticed and didn't know what to say. Either way, M was alone with it. Alone with the balance and the shame and the quiet, constant knowledge that he was failing at something fundamental, something everyone else seemed to handle just fine, and the isolation made everything worse because he couldn't talk about it, couldn't admit it, couldn't ask for help without exposing just how far behind he really was. The card didn't just steal his future, it stole his present. Every moment he spent worrying about the balance was a moment he wasn't fully there, wasn't fully engaged, wasn't fully alive. He'd be at dinner with someone he cared about and halfway through the conversation he'd realize he hadn't heard a word they said because he was thinking about whether he could afford dessert or whether he should just say he was full and save the $15. He'd be at work and catch himself staring at nothing, mind wandering to the app, to the balance, to the interest accruing in real time while he sat there pretending to be productive. He'd be trying to sleep and his brain would start running through scenarios, what-if calculations, disaster planning for bills he hadn't gotten yet and problems that hadn't happened yet but felt inevitable. The card lived in his head rent-free 24/7, a constant background hum of anxiety that colored everything he did and everywhere he went and everyone he talked to. Was always there. Always waiting. Always reminding him that he wasn't free, that he was owned, that his life wasn't his own until the balance was zero and the balance was never going to be zero so his life was never going to be his own. That was the real prison. Not the debt itself, but the way it occupied his mind, colonized his thoughts, hijacked his consciousness, and turned him into someone who couldn't exist outside of it anymore. And the thing that broke him, the thing that finally made him understand just how deep the trap went, was when he realized he'd stopped believing he deserved better. Somewhere along the way, without noticing exactly when it happened, he'd internalized the debt as punishment, as evidence of his failure, as proof that he wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't disciplined enough to be the kind of person who had their life together. The card became a mirror that reflected back everything he hated about himself, and every time he swiped it he was confirming the narrative, reinforcing the belief that this was just who he was. A person who owed. A person who couldn't keep up. A person who'd always be behind. The debt had become his identity, and his identity had become the debt, and he couldn't separate the two anymore. He couldn't imagine a version of himself that wasn't defined by the balance, wasn't shaped by the payments, wasn't trapped inside this loop of earning and owing and never getting ahead. The card had taken his future by convincing him he didn't deserve one. By making him believe that this, right here, this endless cycle of survival and sacrifice and slow-motion suffocation, was all he was worth. That he'd already gotten more than he deserved by using credit he couldn't afford, and now he had to pay for it, not just with money but with his dignity, his joy, his sense of possibility, his belief that life could be different. The card hadn't just stolen his future. It had convinced him he never had one to begin with. Em thought about his parents sometimes, how they'd warned him about credit cards, how they'd told him to be careful, how they'd said debt was dangerous. And he'd nodded and agreed and thought he understood, but he didn't understand. Not really. Because they talked about it like it was a financial problem, and it wasn't a financial problem, it was a spiritual one. It was a soul problem. It was the kind of thing that got inside you and changed the way you saw yourself and the world and your place in it. It wasn't just numbers on a screen, it was a lens that distorted everything, a weight that pressed down on everything, a voice that whispered under everything telling you that you were less, you were weak, you were failing, you were trapped, and you deserved to be trapped because you put yourself here. And maybe that was true. Maybe he did put himself here. But the card made sure he stayed here. Made sure he never forgot. Made sure every single day he woke up and remembered that he was owned, that his time wasn't his, that his future was being siphoned away one minimum payment at a time, and there was nothing he could do about it except keep paying and keep hoping and keep pretending that eventually things would get better, even though deep down he knew they wouldn't. That was the real cost. Not the money. The hope. The card took his hope and replaced it with resignation. With acceptance. With the quiet belief that this was just how things were now and how they'd always be, and fighting it was pointless, so why even try? Em still has the card. Still uses it. Still makes the minimum payment every month like clockwork. The balance is higher now than it was a year ago. He doesn't check it as much anymore because checking it doesn't change anything, and not checking it at least lets him pretend for a few days that maybe things are different, maybe the numbers shifted in his favor somehow, maybe some mistake got corrected and he's not as deep as he thinks. But he is. He's deeper. And the thing is, he's not even trying to get out anymore. He's just trying to survive it. Trying to make it through each month without drowning. Trying to keep his head above water while the debt pulls him down inch by inch, so slowly he barely notices until he looks back and realizes how far under he already is. The prison didn't break him with violence or drama or some big catastrophic moment. It broke him with time. With repetition. With the slow, steady erosion of his belief that anything could ever be different. He wakes up, goes to work, comes home, pays the minimum, swipes the card, and does it all again the next day. That's his life now. That's what his future looks like. An endless loop of owing and paying and owing more. And somewhere deep inside, in a place he doesn't let himself look at too closely, he knows he'll probably die with this debt. Not because he'll never make enough to pay it off, but because the system isn't designed for him to pay it off. It's designed for him to carry it. Forever. Like a cross. Like a curse. Like a sentence he can never finish serving. The worst part isn't that he's trapped. The worst part is that he's not alone. There are millions of people just like him, walking around with smiles on their faces and cards in their wallets, pretending everything's fine while something invisible eats them from the inside out. They're all prisoners in the same system, all feeding the same machine, all trading their futures for the temporary relief of a minimum payment, and nobody talks about it because talking about it means admitting it, and admitting it means facing how powerless they really are. So they just keep swiping, keep paying, keep shrinking, keep disappearing into the debt until there's nothing left of them but the balance and the autopay and the quiet acceptance that this is just what life costs now. M sees them sometimes, catches glimpses of that same look in other people's eyes when someone mentions money or bills or credit scores. That flash of panic. That barely concealed dread. That exhaustion that has nothing to do with being tired and everything to do with being defeated. They're everywhere. Walking ghosts in a prison nobody can see. And the guards, the ones who built this system and profit from it, they're invisible too. Faceless corporations. Algorithm-driven interest rates. Terms and conditions nobody reads. The prison has no walls you can touch, no bars you can see, no warden you can confront. It's just there. Inside you. Around you. Bleeding you dry so slowly you convince yourself it's normal. And doesn't think about freedom anymore. Doesn't let himself imagine what it would feel like to have zero balance, zero interest, zero minimum payment hanging over his head. Doesn't dream about what he'd do with that $140 a month if it was actually his to keep. Because imagining it makes the reality worse, and the reality is already unbearable enough without adding the weight of impossible dreams on top of it. So he just exists, just survives, just keeps moving through the motions of a life that stopped feeling like his a long time ago. The card owns him. He knows it. And knowing it doesn't change it. Nothing changes it. The prison stays locked. The balance stays high. The future stays stolen. And M keeps paying, keeps swiping, keeps feeding the thing that's killing him, because stopping means facing the truth, and the truth is too big, too heavy, too final. So he doesn't stop. He just keeps going. One day at a time. One payment at a time. One piece of his soul at a time. Until there's nothing left to take. And that's the real horror of it. Not that the prison exists, but that it's so perfectly designed you forget you're in it. You forget there was ever a time before it. You forget what it felt like to make choices based on what you wanted instead of what the balance allowed. You forget who you were before the debt redefined you. You forget that freedom was ever even an option. The card doesn't just trap you. It makes you complicit in your own captivity. It makes you believe that this is normal, that everyone lives like this, that suffering under the weight of invisible debt is just part of being a responsible adult. And by the time you realize it's not normal, by the time you see the trap clearly, you're already so deep inside it that getting out feels impossible. So you stop trying. You stop fighting. You stop believing. And you just pay. Forever. Until the debt is all you are and all you'll ever be. That's the prison. That's the trap. That's what it means to be owned by a piece of plastic you thought was helping you. M's story doesn't end. It just continues. Same prison. Same chains. Same invisible carcerero on the other side of the statement, patient and immortal, knowing he'll be back next month and the month after that and every month until he dies. The card doesn't need to win. It already won. It won the moment M believed he needed it. The moment he thought the minimum payment was mercy. The moment he accepted that this is just how things are. That was the moment the door locked and the key disappeared and the future started getting stolen piece by piece. And he'll never get it back. None of them will. Because the system doesn't give back what it takes. Just takes, and takes, and takes, until there's nothing left but the balance, and the silence, and the slow, suffocating knowledge that you traded your entire life for the temporary comfort of not drowning today. Even though you're drowning anyway. Just slower. Just quieter. Just alone enough that nobody notices until it's too late. This isn't over. M's story is just one thread in a web that's bigger and darker than you realize. If you thought the credit card prison was bad, wait until you see what's next. The next layer of the trap. The next mechanism stealing your future while you're too distracted to notice. This isn't entertainment. This is a map. And you need to see the whole thing if you're ever gonna find the exit. Hit that next video now. Not because I'm telling you to. Because you need to know what's really happening before it's too late. Before you end up like M. Before the prison becomes so familiar you forget it's even there. Go. Now. The clock's already running and you don't have as much time as you think.